Hey everybody. Wait, did I press record? What am I doing here? God, I'm a mess. Okay. What was I gonna say? Alright, this is a section. I'm just reading a section from Michael Heinrich's How to Read Marx's Capital, Commentary, Explanations on the Beginning Chapters. The section that I'm going to be reading is section 4 of chapter 1, which is titled The Fetishism of the Commodity and Its Secret, page 163 to 177 of Marx's Capital. The sections of this section are A, quote, whence then arises the enigmatic character of the product of labor as soon as it assumes the form of a commodity, end quote. B, the, quote, peculiar social character of the labor which produces commodities, end quote. Retroactive socialization, second paragraph of 165 to second paragraph 166. C, the knowledge of value and the, quote, objective semblance, end quote. Third paragraph 166. D, the society's movement taking on a life of its own and its content. E, quote, objective forms of thought, end quote. Second paragraph 168 to second paragraph 169. F, forms of production not based on commodity production. Third paragraph 169 to last paragraph 173. G, religion and mode of production, second paragraph 172 to first paragraph 173. H, commodity and value in political economy, the analysis of fetishism as a precondition for a critique of political economy. So, let's go. The reason I'm reading this is because a friend of mine in our little discussion group is doing a presentation on commodity fetishism, and I want to be able to participate meaningfully in the conversation. Got to brush up a little bit on my commodity fetishism knowledge. Anyway, in the title of this subsection, Marx speaks for the first time of the, quote, fetish character of the commodity, end quote. Marx also refers to a, quote, secret, end quote. It remains to be seen what this fetishism consists of and how this fetishism conceals a secret. Using the term, quote, fetish and, quote, fetishism is widespread today. One speaks of, quote, brand fetishism, end quote, if somebody only buys a particular brand, or speaking of certain sexual practices as, quote, fetishism. This general usage of fetish to mean, quote, something of exaggerated importance, end quote, was not unusual in Marx's time. Hence, we can't subsume his concept of fetish. Excuse me, I fucked that last sentence up. This general usage of fetish to mean, quote, something of exaggerated importance, end quote, was not usual in Marx's time. Hence, we can't subsume Marx's concept of fetish to the current usage. A German lexicon from 1840 states, quote, fetishism is the divine worship of usually lifeless objects, powers, or natural phenomena. In fetishism, which is the lowest level of religious thought, the cult object is the sensuous object itself, not its hidden source. Insofar as it expresses its power to people's best disadvantage or advantage. The characteristic of this form of religion is arbitrary choice and arbitrary rejection or variation, end quote. This quotation demonstrates that fetishism was regarded as something primitive and irrational, from which bourgeois society, which understood itself to be completely rational, sorely wanted to take distance. For that reason, Marx is characterizing capitalist relations as fetishistic, thereby questioning capitalist relations' rationality, was a much greater provocation in the 19th century than it is today when there is widespread talk of fetishism. Marx's reasoning is very dense, especially in the first few pages of the fetish section. Every single sentence requires precise reading. That's why the commentary on these pages is very thorough. Section A, quote, whence then arises the enigmatic character of the product of labor as soon as it assumes the form of a commodity, end quote. Quote, a commodity appears at first sight an extremely obvious trivial thing, but its analysis brings out that it is a very strange thing, abounding in metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties, end quote. Two important claims are implicit in these initial sentences of the section on fetishism. The sentence concerns the level of argumentation. The level of argumentation. This claim is linked to Capital's very first two sentences. The, quote, analysis of the commodity, end quote, announced there has now been carried out, including an examination of the substance of value, the magnitude of value, and the value form. Now, Marx will draw certain conclusions from the analysis that has taken place. Quote, its analysis brings out, end quote. Now Marx will draw certain conclusions from the analysis that has taken place, quote, its analysis brings out, end quote. The other implicit statement concerns the content of the arguments. The content of the arguments. The section title refers to the, quote, secret, end quote, of fetishism, and we must carefully attempt to locate that secret. Marx says that the commodity is not, quote, at first sight, end quote, something mysterious. We are all familiar with commodities. Rather, it is the analysis that brings out the secret, quote, metaphysical subtleties, end quote, and, quote, theological niceties, end quote. Analysis hasn't solved a mystery because there was no mystery calling for a solution. Rather, analysis has shown us that there is something mysterious, and that mystery is now the issue. Marx begins to track down the mystery by briefly reviewing the course of the analysis. In the first paragraph, Marx notes two things. One, there is nothing mysterious about the commodity as a use value, for example, a table, which remains a, quote, ordinary sensuous thing, end quote. Two, things are different when we consider the table as a commodity. Quote, but as soon as the table emerges as a commodity, the table changes into a thing which transcends sensuousness. Bracket, corrected translation, it changes into a sensuous, extrasensory thing. Ein sinnlich über sinnliches Ding, end bracket. End quote. How can Marx refer to the commodity as, quote, a sensuous, extrasensory thing, end quote? Inasmuch as the commodity is a use value, the commodity is, quote, sensuous, end quote. That is, perceivable with our five senses. Yet as a commodity, the commodity has a dual nature of being use value, end value. And Marx stated at the beginning of chapter 1 that the objectivity of value was a, quote, phantom-like objectivity, end quote. The objectivity of value remained, quote, impossible to grasp, end quote, in the case of the individual commodity. This is why Marx could speak of value as not a natural but, quote, supranatural property, end quote, of things. Marx is obviously referring to these earlier characterizations in speaking now of, quote, extrasensory, end quote, things, and of the commodities, quote, metaphysical subtleties, end quote, and, quote, theological niceties, end quote. This demonstrates that Marx's earlier language, involving terms such as, quote, phantom-like, or, quote, spectral, and, quote, supranatural, end quote, was not merely a question of stylistic idiosyncrasy. Instead, it expressed a specific state of affairs that he will now address systematically. However, as the next paragraph shows, value objectivity's, quote, extrasensory, end quote, dimension is not easily grasped. Quote, the mystical character of the commodity does not therefore arise from the commodity's use value, just as little does the mystical character of the commodity proceed from the nature, content, inhalt, of the determinants of value. End quote. Marx. The first sentence merely repeats one of the previous paragraph's findings. Marx will argue the second sentence's claim in the following. So far, there has been no mention of the, quote, determinants of value, end quote. Yet Marx is obviously referring to the three determinations of value that Marx has analyzed up to now: the substance of value, the magnitude of value, and the value form. Now Marx will discuss their, quote, content, end quote. Marx first speaks of the, quote, physiological fact, end quote, that, regardless of how different the useful labor activities are, the useful labor activities are always the expenditure of brain, nerves, and muscle. Marx thus alludes to the second subsection of Chapter 1, where abstract human labor is determined as, quote, an expenditure of labor power in the physiological sense, end quote. Next, Marx identifies the second determination's content as the, quote, quantity of labor, end quote, which must interest people in all kinds of societies. Third, when people work for each other in some manner, people's labor also acquires a, quote, social form, end quote. Marx thereby alludes to an idea developed earlier in the value form section. In commodity production, the product is only, quote, social, end quote, if it becomes a commodity, and it becomes a commodity when it acquires a value form and its value is expressed objectively. The appendix to the first edition of Capital states this more clearly. See the passage from that appendix quoted in the commentary on the third peculiarity of the equivalent form. Under the conditions of commodity production, labor is thus only social if labor's product acquires a value form. In that sense, we can say that the, quote, content, end quote, of the value form is the social character of labor. It's certainly true that there's nothing, quote, mystical, end quote, about the three, quote, contents, end quote, Marx refers to. But is this really about the, quote, content, end quote, of the determinants of value? The, quote, content, end quote, of value, the substance of value, is not simply labor, but abstract human labor, a social reduction through exchange of the various acts of labor. In the commentary on the second subsection's last paragraph, we pointed out that it's problematic to equate abstract human labor with labor expenditure in the physiological sense. In a similar way, it's problematic to take simply the duration of labor time as a measure for the magnitude of value. What can be measured is no more than the individual labor time expended in a concrete type of labor. The, quote, duration of abstract labor is always bound to average social conditions. So, abstract labor, the duration of abstract labor, cannot be measured directly. And finally, the, quote, content, end quote, of the value form is not simply the, quote, social form, end quote, of labor, but rather the social form of labor that is expended as commodity-producing private labor. And finally, the, quote, content of the value form is not simply the, quote, social form, end quote, of labor, but rather the social form of labor that is expended as commodity-producing private labor. The latter is socialized as, quote, equal human labor, end quote. What Marx calls the, quote, content, end quote, of the, quote, determinants of value, end quote, are in fact trans-historical determinants applying to every society. In all societies, in the first place, there is work and thus expenditure of brain, muscle, and nerves. Second, every society must also concern that society's self with the duration of labor expenditure. Third, in every society, individuals' labor activities must be related to each other somehow. These three transhistorical determinations, however, do not immediately become the, quote, content, end quote, of the determinants of value. Rather, they become that content only in historically determinate forms. The first is abstract human labor, the result of a social process of abstraction. The second of the duration not of concrete but abstract labor, based upon the formation of specific social averages. And the third is the as the social form of a specific type of labor, namely, commodity producing private labor. This means that the, quote, content, end quote, of the determinants of value is itself socially generated in a specific manner and is not at all something transhistorical. Marx made that clear in the earlier analysis, but not in the language he uses here. So far, Marx has only identified what does not explain the mysterious character of the products of labor when they assume the commodity form. Now in the third paragraph of page 164 comes the answer, quote, clearly it arises from this form itself, end quote. Hence the secret of the commodity lies in the commodity form. Through the commodity form, the, quote, content, end quote, of the determinants of value, that is, the properties of the acts of labor, their equality as human labor, their duration, and the relations of producers, become, in turn, objective properties of the social products of labor, value objectivity, the magnitude of value, and social relations among those products. The next paragraph explains what this means in detail. Its first sentence calls for a close reading. Quote, the mysterious character of the commodity form consists therefore simply in the fact that the commodity reflects the social characteristics of men's own labor as objective characteristics of the products of labor themselves as the socio-natural properties of these things. Hence, it also reflects the social relation of the producers to the sum total of labor, bracket, Gesamtarbeit, and bracket, as a social relation between objects, a relation which exists apart from and outside the producers, end quote. Marx. Page 164 to 65. If one simplifies this sentence somewhat, then it states that the mysterious character of the commodity form consists in the fact that the, quote, social character of labor, end quote, is, quote, reflected, end quote, as, quote, objective characteristics of the products of labor, end quote. Marx. Let's now turn to the various expressions that show up in this sentence. The reference to labor's, quote, social characteristics, end quote, means that acts of labor are socially interrelated, that acts of labor's products are useful for others, that the acts of labor's products are useful for others. That is, human labor, one's own labor counts as qualitatively equal to other acts of labor. One's own labor counts as qualitatively equal to other acts of labor, and that it does so quantitatively in a specific measure, and that one's labor counts qualitatively equal to other acts of labor, does so Jesus Christ. And one's own labor counts as qualitatively equal to other acts of labor quantitatively in a specific measure. These social characteristics of labor are reflected as, quote, objective characteristics of the products of labor, end quote. Whether others recognize a product of labor as useful is demonstrated under the conditions of commodity production by that product of labor possessing, quote, value, end quote, at all. The quantitative relation that the labor expended to produce that commodity bears to other labor activities is demonstrated by its, quote, magnitude of value, end quote. Both value and magnitude of value appear to adhere to labor products, quote, objectively, end quote. That is, as an object, in a similar manner to its physical attributes. Marx specifies here that these, quote, objective characteristics, end quote, are, quote, social natural properties, end quote. What does social natural properties mean? Quote, natural properties, end quote, are usually taken to be something independent of human beings and society, something existing in nature without society playing a role. In that sense, quote, nature and, quote, society are often treated as opposites. Quote, society is created by humans, but, quote, nature is independent of humans. Marx now joins the terms. Even without analyzing, quote, value scientifically, value is clearly not a natural property like weight or hardness, meaning that values something social. Yet, value is out of people's control just like a natural property. Value is out of people's control just like a natural property, such as a diamond's hardness. Value only exists in society, but value operates in society like a natural property of labor products. A caveat. It's not Marx who claims as a result of his analysis that, quote, value is a socio-natural property, end quote. Rather, Marx states that the commodity form, quote, reflects the social characteristics of labor as a, quote, socio-natural property, end quote. The verb, quote, reflects, end quote, expresses, on the one hand, something objective, a process independent of human manipulation, and on the other hand, suggests a degree of distortion. A real mirror always reproduces things as an inverted reflection and, depending on the mirror's construction, might enlarge, reduce, or warp things. We will come back to this when dealing with the next sentence. First, we have to deal with the remainder of this sentence, which states that, quote, the social relation of the products, quote, the social relation of the producers to the sum total of labor, end quote, is reflected as, quote, a social relation between objects, a relation which exists apart from and outside the producers, end quote. Marx introduces the expression, quote, sum total of labor, end quote, Gesamtarbeit, here, but does not further explain it. Only a few paragraphs later do we get more details about, quote, the aggregate labor of society, end quote. Gesellschaftliche Gesamtarbeit. It is the same German term but differently translated. For now, we can only say individual producers expend the individual producer's labor privately, independently from other individual producers. Still, in a society characterized by a division of labor, individual producers objectively depend on one another. See the commentary on the equivalent form's third peculiarity. Nevertheless, the relation of the individual producers' private acts of labor to all the other private acts of labor, that is, the sum total of labor, confronts them only as an objective property of their labor products, as, quote, value, and the, quote, magnitude of value, end quote. In that sense, quote, the social relations of the producers to the sum total of labor, end quote, becomes, quote, a social relation between objects, end quote. The next sentence states, quote, through this substitution, the products of labor become commodities, sensuous things which are at the same time supersensible or social. Bracket, corrected translation. Through this quid pro quo, the products of labor become commodities, sensuous, extrasensory, Sinn, übersinnlich, or social things, end bracket, end quote, Marx. Footnote. Marx uses the term, quote, quid pro quo, end quote, originally from the legal context, several times in capital. Quid pro quo means that one thing stands for another, which is not the same as one thing being substituted for another. Additionally, Falk's translation obscures Marx's using exactly the same wording here as on page 163, quote, sensuous extrasensory, end quote. Marx, end footnote. The reflection is a quid pro quo. Social relationships turn into objective properties. Social relationships turn into objective properties. In a quite literal sense, the fact that social relationships appear as objective properties of commodities is precisely what is, quote, extrasensory, end quote. About commodities. Our senses cannot perceive this kind of objective property of commodities. But why does substitution of this kind come with the commodity form? Why does the commodity form reflect the social character of labor as objective characteristics of the product of labor? No answer is provided in this passage. It follows in the next paragraphs, which point B of this commentary addresses. Instead, Marx merely says that it's so, but without explaining why. Marx devotes the rest of the paragraph to the specific character of this quid pro quo. Marx relies on two comparisons. The first comparison relates to how the optical nerves create the image of an external object. Light stimulating the optic nerve presents the light stimulating the optic nerve's self to us, those who are looking, not as stimulation of the optic nerve, but as an object external to the eye. That means that, quote, seeing, end quote, involves a substitution, since by no means do we have the sensation that the optic nerve is being stimulated, but instead perceive something at a certain distance from us. What is special about the commodity form, nevertheless, is not the quid pro quo itself, that one thing stands for another, but rather the kind of quid pro quo taking place. In seeing, light is transmitted from one object to another, the eye. Therefore, light is, quote, a physical relation between physical things, end quote. Maybe I misread that. I'll just reread it. In seeing, light is transmitted from one object to another, the eye. Therefore, it's, quote, a physical relation between physical things, end quote. In the case of the commodity form, however, it is precisely not the case. Quote, it is nothing but the definite social relation between men themselves, which assumes here, for men, the fantastic, bracket, correction, phantasmagoric, end bracket, form of a relation between things, end quote. What does Marx mean by the relationship's, quote, phantasmagoric form, end quote? The editors of the Marx-Engels Werke 23 explain phantasmagoric as meaning, quote, magical, illusory, end quote, zauberhaft, trügerisch. However, that doesn't entirely capture the word's significance in the 19th century. The expression arose around 1800 in Paris, where it referred to new, complex techniques used in theater performances. Projections, reflections, enlargements, and so on were used to generate spectacular visual effects, such as the invocation of ghosts, which appeared quite real to the audience. See Albrecht Schune's commentary on Faust in Goethe, 1999. These effects were real to the extent that the audience didn't simply imagine these effects, though these effects did depend on technical equipment invisible to the audience. Because of the, quote, phantasmagoric, end quote, relation residing in the commodity, the analogy to light's impression upon the optic nerve is adequate. According to Marx, an adequate analogy is only to be found in, quote, the misty realm of religion, end quote. There, the products of the human brain appear as autonomous figures, endowed with a life of their own, which enter into relations both with each other and with the human race. So it is in the world of commodities with the products of men's hands, end quote. Marx picks up here on a central theme from the critique of religion as carried out by philosopher Ludwig. Sorry, I feel like my mind spaced out for a second. Sorry, I got to reread the quote. According to Marx, an adequate analogy is only to be found in the, quote, misty realm of religion, end quote. Quote, in the misty realm of religion, the products of the human brain appear as autonomous figures endowed with the products of the human, with a life of their own. Jesus Christ. Quote, in the misty realm of religion, the products of the human brain appear as autonomous figures endowed with a life of their own, which enter into relations both with each other and with the human race. So it is in the world of commodities with the products of men's hands, end quote. Marx picks up here a central theme from the critique of religion as carried out by philosopher Ludwig Feuerbach. The definition of fetishism quoted above from the 19th century lexicon stressed that the, quote, sensuous object itself, end quote, a piece of wood, leather, etc., which is a man-made thing, becomes the cult object. Feuerbach emphasized that the great religions, including Christianity, do basically the same thing. These religions' gods are products of the human mind. The gods are idealizations of real human beings. And human beings in turn submit to human beings' own products. Marx compares the human mind's products, the gods of the religions, which have become independent of those products' creators, with the human hands products, commodities, which have taken on a life of their own. Quote, I call this fetishism, which attaches that fetishism self to the products of labor as soon as the products of labor are produced as commodities and is therefore inseparable from the production of commodities. Inseparable from the production of commodities, end quote. Michael Heinrich. Emphasis Michael Heinrich. End quote Marx, emphasis Michael Heinrich. And if you've never listened to me read anything before, two things I should say. One, if I try to follow the pronouns of things because I can get lost, and I'm sure other people get lost. I don't think I'm especially inept in that regard. But in terms of finding it difficult to follow pronouns sometimes. And And the other thing that I do is if I repeat something, it generally means, unless stated otherwise, that it's in italics, and hence important. This last sentence clearly shows that Marx does not view commodity fetishism as merely a phenomenon of consciousness that can be dispelled by explanations. Instead, fetishism is the necessary consequence of a specific social practice. Fetishism is the necessary consequence of a specific social practice. Commodity production, which is then reflected in consciousness. Only when that social practice disappears will fetishism disappear. The next few pages of this subsection, 163 to 165, are just a sketch of what Marx means by, quote, commodity fetishism, end quote. The first few pages of this subsection point out how social relationships among commodity producers are reflected back as labor products' objective properties. Many presentations of fetishism go no further than this observation. However, the subsection comprises 12 more pages of the book, which don't just provide additional information, but are actually necessary to understanding commodity fetishism. One second, sorry. I apologize. Okay. Just trying to see how long I'd been reading. I'm trying to read I try to do things in hour stretches because, in at least hour stretches in my life, generally speaking, so that I don't fucking, it keeps me from getting fucking distracted by bullshit. The longer you do something and the more you're like, I'm doing this and that's it for a while. I think it's good for the attention span. And I think it's good for just like not filling your life with a bunch of bullshit activities. So, section B. The, quote, peculiar social character of the labor which produces commodities, unquote. Retroactive socialization. That's not in italics, but I feel like that's really, really important. Retroactive socialization. I'm sure Heinrich will come up in this piece, talk about the concept of post festum, private labor being validated as social labor after the fact of exchange, but maybe not. Maybe I'm not remembering. I read Marx's section on the fetishism. I read the actual chapter of this yesterday, the actual Marx chapter. So I'm reading this now, and I'm like, so I still got it fresh on my brain. Anyway, B. The quote, peculiar, where am I? Quote, reading it, quote, as the foregoing analysis has already demonstrated, this fetishism of the world of commodities arises from the peculiar social character of the labor which produces the world of commodities. End quote. Marx. Quote, the foregoing analysis, end quote, obviously doesn't refer to the immediately preceding pages devoted to Marx's understanding of, quote, commodity fetishism, end quote, but rather to the analysis in the first 3 subsections of Chapter 1. However, those sections do not mention the fetish character of commodities. Therefore, the, quote, foregoing analysis, end quote, only implicitly demonstrated what is now made explicit. This means that no new analysis follows, but rather certain conclusions are drawn from the foregoing analysis. Labor activities occurring in a social context have a, quote, social character, end quote. However, this social character is not the same in all societies, but rather depends on the structuring of that social context. The next 2 paragraphs briefly summarize, quote, the peculiar social character of the labor which produces, bracket, commodities, end quote, Marx. The beginning of the next paragraph elucidates the meaning of the, quote, aggregate labor of society, end quote. Quote, objects of utility become commodities only because those objects of utility are the products of the labor of private individuals who work independently of other private individuals. The sum total of the labor of all these private individuals forms the aggregate labor of society. Bracket, gesellschaftliche Gesamtarbeit, end bracket. Since the products do not come into social contact until since the producers, Jesus Christ, I fucked it up. Since the producers do not come into social contact until the producers exchange the products of the producers' labor, the specific social characteristics of the producer's private labor appears only within this exchange. I'm going to repeat that sentence. This is still Marx speaking, just because I think it's important. Since the producers do not come into social contact until the producers exchange the products of their labor, the specific social characteristics of the producers' private labors appear only within this exchange. In other words, the labor of the private individual manifests itself as an element of the total labor of society, bracket, gesellschaftliche Gesamtarbeit, end bracket, only through the relations which the act of exchange establishes between the products and through their mediation between the producers, end quote. Marx does not use the term, quote, aggregate labor of society, end quote, in a transhistorical sense to designate, for example, all the productivity a society carries out. Instead, Marx is concerned with the aggregate labor in a commodity-producing society. The aggregate labor in a commodity-producing society. In a commodity-producing society, the particular labor activities are not yet social when the particular labor activities are carried out. There is no prior coordination that would make the particular labor activities into components of the social fabric from the beginning. In fact, because of the social division of labor, labor activities do stand in a relationship of objective interdependence. A relationship of objective interdependence. But the labor activities are undertaken privately, that is, independently of one another. In the second sentence, Marx refers to how these private labor activities constitute the aggregate labor of society. As the previous sentence made clear, that does not mean that all privately expended labor contributes to the aggregate labor of society, but only those labor activities whose products are actually exchanged. I'm going to repeat that. As the previous sentence made clear, that does not mean that all privately expended labor contributes to the aggregate labor of society, but only those labor activities whose products are actually exchanged. Only private labor activities of that kind, quote, manifest themselves as an element of the total labor of society, end quote. And private labor activities of that kind do so, quote, only through the relations which the act of exchange establishes between the products, end quote. Marx. Labor creating products not intended for exchange or products that do not find buyers on the market do not enter into the aggregate labor of a commodity-producing society. In effect, Marx has already addressed this special summing up of private labor in the first subsection of Chapter 1, when Marx explained the concept of, quote, socially necessary labor time, end quote. In the first subsection of Chapter 1, Marx observed that, quote, the total labor power of society, which is manifested in the values of the world of commodities, counts here as one homogeneous mass of human labor power, end quote. Marx, emphasis Michael Heinrich. The activity of this, quote, one homogeneous mass of human labor power, end quote, is precisely the historically specific aggregate social labor under discussion here. If Marx includes only those private labor activities whose products are exchanged in the aggregate social labor, Marx is not arbitrarily excluding other labor activities. Rather, the excluding of other types of labor reflects the specific kind of socialization, that is, the way social cohesion is created under the conditions of commodity production. The social bond only takes place via exchange. The social bond only takes place via exchange. Addendum. The question of what contributes to aggregate social labor is particularly important for the debate about reproductive labor in the household, which is still primarily done by women. Labor of that kind is crucially necessary for the maintenance and reproduction of human life. However, under the conditions of commodity production, labor activities only contribute to the aggregate labor of society when performed outside the household setting, since the product of labor, material goods such as meals, but also care and education, are consumed in the household without ever taking on the form of commodities. To be part of the aggregate social labor requires that the products and services be offered and sold as commodities. End of addendum. In the quote's third sentence, Marx addresses what is so peculiar about this form of socialization. Social contact between producers first occurs in exchange. Social contact between producers first occurs in exchange, and that's why the, quote, social characteristics, end quote, of private acts of labor first show themselves in exchange. How do these, quote, social characteristics, end quote, of private acts of labor reveal themselves? Marx doesn't say so here, but we already know how. They show themselves as objective characteristics of the products of labor. Objective characteristics of the products of labor. On page 164, Marx claimed that the commodity form, quote, reflects, end quote, the social characteristics of private labor as objective characteristics of the products of labor. Marx did not, however, explain how this reflecting happens. The third sentence of the quotation above implicitly provides the explanation. Under the conditions of commodity production, the social characteristics of labor first show themselves in exchange because, quote, the producers do not come into social contact until the producers exchange the products of the producer's labor, end quote. But in exchange, producers do not relate directly to one another. Producers instead relate the products of the producer's labor to one another. For that reason, the social characteristics of private acts of labor can only show themselves as objective characteristics of the products of labor. Only retroactively, through the exchange of labor products, are the individual private acts of labor actually socialized. This has an important consequence that Marx addresses in the paragraph's last sentence. Quote, "To the producers, therefore, the social relations between their private labors appear as what they are, i.e., they do not appear as direct social relations between persons in their work, but rather as material, bracket, dinglich, end bracket, relations between persons and social relations between things," end quote. Marx. Marx, therefore, does not consider commodity fetishism a question of false consciousness. The relationships among producers' private labor activities may appear to producers as a social relationship between things, but these social relationships between things appear to the producers as, quote, "what they are," end quote. In a commodity-producing society, there are no direct social relationships among producers. People are private producers, independent of one another, who do not coordinate their labor. It is only things that stand in a social relation, which is mediated by the, quote, "extrasensory," end quote, quality of value. Commodity fetishism is not an illusion. Commodity fetishism is a real phenomenon, if only within a commodity-producing society. Commodity fetishism is not an illusion. Commodity fetishism is a real phenomenon, if only within a commodity-producing society. The next paragraph elaborates on the last assertion, that the social relationships among producers' private labor activities appear to the producers as what the social relationships among producers' private labor activities are, a social relation among things. Quote, "It is only by being exchanged that the products of labor acquire a socially uniform objectivity as values, which is distinct from their sensuously varied objectivity as articles of utility. The division of the product of labor into a useful thing and a thing possessing value appears in practice only when exchange value has already acquired a sufficient extension and importance to allow useful things to be produced for the purpose of being exchanged, so that their character as values has already to be taken into consideration during production," end quote. Marx. Earlier in this commentary, I mentioned... Sorry, there's a footnote that I missed, I just saw here. It's in relation to earlier, the use of the word dinglich. Footnote says, Fox wrongly inserted the German word dinglich here. Marx did not use, quote, dinglich, but rather sachlich in this sentence, which is more general than, quote, dinglich. End footnote. Earlier in this commentary, I mentioned the debate about when products become commodities and acquire value objectivity, whether products become commodities and acquire value objectivity occurs within exchange or in the production process. Traditional Marxism usually holds that products become commodities and acquire value objectivity in the production process. Marx assumes a clear position in this passage, similar to that of the revision manuscript titled Ergänzungen und Veränderungen for capital, commented below in Appendix 4. Products acquire value objectivity, quote, only by being exchanged, end quote. Marx's claim here is not an arbitrary claim. Rather, Marx's claim expresses the specific social character of commodity-producing labor. Such labor is private labor, and its socialization first occurs retroactively through the exchange of products. Although a society based upon commodity production produces goods with a view to exchanging those goods, society being based upon commodity production producing goods with a view to exchanging goods doesn't imply that those objects possess value objectivity before exchange. Marx expresses that very precisely when writing that, quote, their character as values has already to be taken into consideration during production, end quote. Marx, emphasis Michael Heinrich. The character of these products as values is not already present, but rather, quote, taken into consideration, end quote. So far, nothing else has been said about the details of production. From the first sentence of Chapter 1, we know that Marx is dealing with capitalist production, that the character of commodities as values is, quote, taken into consideration, end quote, as Marx says, powerfully shapes the production process and working conditions, which are often destructive for the workers. Parenthesis, the first volume of Capital offers a thorough treatment of these working conditions, end parenthesis. What Marx means by, quote, taking into consideration, end quote, relates to the producers, who under capitalist conditions are not the workers actually producing things, but rather the capitalists commanding production, based on their knowledge of the market and the production conditions. These producers expect that their products can be exchanged, and that when they are exchanged, their value will have a specific magnitude. However, this isn't to say that their expectations are actually met. If, for example, there are surprisingly many products on the market that are produced under better technical conditions, it reduces socially necessary labor time, meaning that the products possess a much smaller value than projected. Precisely because a product's magnitude of value depends upon multiple average social conditions. Precisely because a product's magnitude of value depends upon multiple average social conditions, a product's magnitude of value cannot be determined by a single product's conditions of production prior to exchange. Marx continues, quote, from this moment on, the labor of the individual producer acquires a twofold social character. On the one hand, the labor of the individual producer must, as a definite useful kind of labor, satisfy a definite social need, and thus maintain the labor of the individual producer's position as an element of the total labor, as a branch of the social division of labor, which originally sprang up spontaneously. On the other hand, it can satisfy the manifold needs to the individual producer himself only insofar as every particular kind of useful private labor can be exchanged with, i.e. counts as the equal of, bracket, Gleichgeld, and bracket, every other kind of useful private labor, end quote. Marx. Quote, from this moment on, end quote, refers to the point in time when exchange becomes developed enough to have things' value character to be, quote, taken into consideration, end quote, during production. From that time forward, we can speak not only of commodity exchange, but also of commodity production. This does not mean that the individual product automatically becomes a commodity, but rather that production takes place only for the purpose of exchange. The product is intended to be a commodity from the very beginning. And that aim also shapes the whole of production. What does the, quote, twofold social character, end quote, of private labor refer to? When private labor is being carried out, it is not yet a component of the aggregate labor of society. It first becomes so. When private labor is being carried out, private labor is not yet a component of the aggregate labor of society. Private labor first becomes a component of the aggregate labor of society when that private labor it acquires both characteristics mentioned above. The first characteristic, that is useful labor, that private labor satisfies some kind of social need, has to be fulfilled in every society based on the division of labor and production. The second characteristic is that every particular useful private labor activity is exchangeable with every other useful private labor activity and therefore, quote, counts equal of, end quote, gleich gilt it. Every particular useful private labor activity being exchangeable with every other useful private labor activity and therefore counts equals to it, the private labor, the latter only exists in a fuck that up. Every particular useful private labor activity being exchangeable with every other useful private labor activity and therefore, quote, counts equal of, end quote, gleich gilt it. The latter only exists in a society based on commodity production. About this equal counting, Marx writes, quote, equality in the full sense between different kinds of labor can be arrived at only if we abstract from the different kinds of labors real inequality. We reduce the different kinds of labor to the characteristic the different kinds of labor have in common, that of being the expenditure of human labor power, of human labor in the abstract, end quote. Marx. This, quote, equal counting, end quote, of the various types of labor is not something pre-existing. This equal counting must first be created through a, quote, reduction of the various labor activities of to the characteristic of being expenditure of human labor power, a reduction that, quote, abstracts, end quote, from, quote, real inequality, end quote. In that sense, equality is only present to the extent that an abstraction from the real differences and the reduction to abstract human labor actually take place. Addendum. In Marx's revision manuscript, Ergänzungen und Veränderungen, for the second edition, there is a sentence following this passage that was later incorporated into the French translation. Quote, the reduction of various concrete private acts of labor to this abstraction of equal human labor is only carried out through exchange, which in fact equates products of different acts of labor with each other. End quote. Marx. Here again, Marx clearly states that it is only through exchange that the abstracting from real inequality takes place, creating the equality of labor activities. Therefore, quote, the, quote, abstraction of equal human labor, end quote, only exists in exchange. However, if commodities' values are, quote, crystals, end quote, of this abstract human labor, which only exist through the reduction occurring in exchange, then neither does value exist prior to exchange. Value can at most be estimated, that is, quote, taken into consideration, end quote. End of addendum. At the paragraph's end, Marx points out that private producers perceive the dual social character of commodity-producing labor. Marx says that the private producers' brains reflect the dual social character of commodity-producing labor. Private producers perceive the dual social character of commodity-producing labor, however, quote, only in the forms which appear in practical intercourse, in the exchange of products, end quote. And in the exchange of products, the social characteristics of labor appear not as determinations of labor, but as material properties of labor's products. And there, and in exchange, the social characteristics of labor appear not as determinations of labor, but as material properties of labor's products. The social usefulness of private labor appears as the labor product's usefulness to others, while the equality of private labor activities appear as the value objectivity shared by labor products. The, quote, peculiar, end quote, social character of commodity-producing labor, mentioned on page 165, has thus been explained. It is a retroactive socialization of labor, in which the social determinations of labor become objective determinations of labor products. In this way, the previous paragraph's concluding statement that the relationships between private producers appear to private producers as, quote, what the relationships between private producers are, end quote, namely not as direct social relationships between people, but as social relationships between things, is now thoroughly clarified. One moment. Sorry, 1 second. New section, C, knowledge of value and, quote, objective semblance, end quote. Marx now draws some conclusions about everyday knowledge of value. Quote, men do not therefore bring the products of men's labor into relation with each other as values, because men see these objects merely as the material integuments of homogeneous human labor. The reverse is true. By equating their different products to each other in exchange as values, men equate their different kinds of labor as human labor. Men equate their different kinds of labor as human labor by equating different products to each other in exchange as values without being aware of it. End quote, Marx. In a commodity-producing society, people regard the products of their labor as, quote, values. People might have quite disparate ideas about what's behind these values, and labor may or may not enter the picture. However, the equating of different labor activities in consciousness is not a precondition for the act of exchange taking place. The equating of different labor activities in consciousness is the act of exchange taking place's objective result. I'm going to repeat that. However, the equating of different labor activities in consciousness is not a precondition for the act of exchange taking place. The equating of different labors is the act of exchange. I keep fucking this up. I'm trying to follow the pronouns, but it's hard, so I'll just not do that for this sentence. However, the equating of different labor activities in consciousness is not a precondition for the act of exchange taking place. It is its objective result. Objective result. In the German original, in the original German version of the sentence, quote, they do this without being aware of it, end quote. Quote, Sie wissen das nicht, aber sie tun es, end quote. Marx echoes a famous Bible passage. According to Luke, Jesus' last words on the cross were, quote, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, end quote. Luke 23:34, which is a much-quoted phrase even today. Footnote. However, these are not only the last words attributed to Jesus. These are not the only last words attributed to Jesus. Instead of the serene sentence from Luke, Matthew and Mark have handed down the despairing, quote, my God, why hast thou forsaken me, end quote. Finally, in John, there is just this sententious phrase, quote, it is finished, end footnote. Hence, Marx characterizes those engaged in exchange as ignorant like those who mocked and tortured Jesus. This phrase depicts, at the most general level, the unconscious character of socialization. The unconscious character of socialization. That is, the forming of the social bond in an economy based on commodity production. Socialization takes place through individuals' conscious activity, but the individuals by no means have to be aware of the structures and forms of this socialization. Individuals do it without really knowing what they're doing. Addendum. Marx's basic insight that people engage in exchange don't know what they're doing marks a fundamental difference with classical political economy and neoclassical economics. Neoclassical economics assume that economic actors know what economic actors are doing and that the economic fabric emerges from the economic actor's conscious activity. Thus, Adam Smith, who attributed commodities' value to labor time used in making or acquiring commodities, but without distinguishing between abstract human labor and concrete useful labor, argued that, for example, a beaver exchanges for 2 deer because people know that hunting beaver requires twice as much labor as deer. Friedrich Engels based his notion of a pre-capitalist, quote, simple commodity production, end quote, developed in the, quote, supplement and addendum, end quote, to the 3rd volume of Capital, on a similar reflection. People make exchanges based on the labor times expended in commodity production because people know what these times are. With this conception of, quote, simple commodity production, end quote, Engels wanted to present pure value relations, not yet capitalistically determined relations in a clear way. Just as a side note, there's an important piece that discusses this topic called The Myth of Simple Commodity Production by Chris Arthur. Back to the text. However, the notion of, quote, simple commodity production, end quote, is questionable in a historical sense, because there were no pre-capitalist societies in which commodity production without capital played a dominant role. Additionally, the idea is questionable in a theoretical sense, if the idea is taken as the content of Marx's analysis of commodities. Since Engels, quote, simple commodity production, end quote, assumes knowledge on the part of the people acting instead of the people acting's lack of awareness, it does not capture Marx's object of investigation at the beginning of Capital. For more, see my introduction, Heinrich 2012, that's on this channel. That whole book is on this channel. It's one of the first recordings I did. If people were aware of what they were doing in people's economic activity, then the economy would be a transparent... So that's... Sorry, I forgot to say. End of addendum. If people were aware of what they were doing in their economic activity, then the economy would be a transparent sphere in which nothing were hidden. Marx's frequent references to, quote, mysteries and, quote, enigmas, and his emphasizing of concepts such as, quote, fetishism, quote, inversion, and, quote, mystification, are not simply questions of literary style. Marx uses this language quite consciously to demonstrate that the capitalist economy's supposed transparency and rationality is merely a superficial appearance that conceals something in need of deciphering. Marx appends footnote 29 to the sentence just quoted, quote, they do this without being aware of it, end quote, and indicates briefly there once more why this is so. A detailed explanation appears on 165 to 166. The note refers to the Italian economist Galliani, who wrote that value is a relation between people. Marx observes that Galliani should have added, quote, a relation concealed beneath a material shell, end quote. In this way, Marx points out the specificity of this kind of human relation. This kind of human relation is mediated by objects. This kind of human relation is mediated by objects. Addendum. Marx repeatedly points out that the mediation of human relations by objects is characteristic of all economic relationships in capitalism. In the contribution to the critique of political economy, for example, Marx characterizes the difficulties economists have in grasping capital. Quote, the phenomenon they have just ponderously described as a thing reappears as a social relation and, a moment later, having been defined as a social relation, teases them once more as a thing, end quote. Marx. End addendum. For many leftists, too, the core of Marx's analysis is that economic categories such as value, money, and capital are the expression of certain relations between human beings. Many leftists emphasize that these relations, far from being peaceful and harmonic, represent a permanent struggle, ultimately a struggle between social classes. However, that perspective merely highlights what capitalist society has in common with all other class societies. Marx, by contrast, is concerned with the specificity of capitalist social relations, that is, how those relations differ from the relations of other societies. This specificity consists precisely in economic relationships between people being, quote, concealed beneath a material shell, end quote, as Marx had just pointed out in reference to Galliani. Addendum. In the Communist Manifesto, which was published in 1848, almost 20 years before the first volume of Capital, there is no evidence yet of this insight into capitalism's specificity. Whereas after the well-known prologue, quote, there is a specter haunting Europe, ... end quote, Marx began his analysis with the famous sentence, quote, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles, end quote. In Capital, the chapter on classes was to form the conclusion of the third volume. In the manifesto, Marx assumed that classes and class struggle are the self-evident starting point from which everything else can be explained. In Capital, by contrast, Marx has come to understand that, precisely because human relations are, quote, concealed beneath a material shell, end quote, classes and class struggle cannot be the starting point of his presentation, but are rather the results to be reached. If we take the essential feature of Marx's Capital to be the discovery that categories such as value and capital refer to economic structures that express social relations, then we reduce the analysis in Capital to the level of the Communist Manifesto. Since people equate products of their labor as values without knowing what they're actually doing, namely, equating their diverse labor activities, Marx claims that value transforms labor products into a, quote, social hieroglyphic, end quote, and that people then try to decipher the hieroglyphic. Eventually, the work of deciphering produces results. Quote, the belated scientific discovery that the products of labor, insofar as they are values, are merely the material expressions of the human labor expended to produce them, marks an epoch in the history of mankind's development, end quote. With the phrase, quote, belated scientific discovery, end quote, Marx is by no means referring to his own work, but rather the, quote, labor theory of value, end quote, as already formulated by economists such as William Petty, Adam Smith, and David Ricardo, with varying degrees of clarity. However, Marx points out that this was not enough because their discovery, quote, by no means banishes the semblance of objectivity, bracket, corrected translation, objective semblance, Gegenständlichkeit, end bracket, possessed by the social characteristics of labor, end quote. Marx. What does it mean to say that the, quote, objective semblance, end quote, does not disappear? Value is being traced back to labor, but without asking the question of why the labor expended is reflected as an objective property of a product. The economist deciphered the content of value, but took it to be natural that this content is expressed as, quote, value, an objective property of labor products. Marx continues, quote, something which is only valid for this particular form of production, the production of commodities, namely the fact that the specific social character of private labors, carried on independently of each other, consist in their equality as human labor, and, in the product, assumes the form of the existence of value, appears to those caught up in the relations of commodity production, and this is true both before and after the above-mentioned scientific discovery, to be just as ultimately valid as the fact that the scientific dissection of the air into its component parts left the atmosphere itself unaltered in its physical configuration. End quote. Marx. With this, we come to a central point of Marx's argumentation. Marx critiques a mix-up here. Quote, something which is only valid, end quote, under commodity production. The specific social character Marx mentions here is the second social characteristic of private labor he referred to on page 166, appears, quote, to those caught up in the relations of commodity production, end quote, as, quote, ultimately valid, end quote. That is, for them, the products of labor appear to have the character of value in every society, as if value were, as Marx says above, a, quote, socio-natural property, end quote. Why do things appear this way? Because people immersed in capitalist relations do not grasp the objectivity of value as resulting from specific social relations as something socially mediated. Because people immersed in capitalist relations do not grasp the objectivity of value as resulting from specific social relations as something socially mediated. Instead, they take it to be something immediate. So that the objectivity exists independently of specific social relations. Whenever people work, people seem to create, quote, value. When Marx speaks of a, quote, objective semblance, end quote, Marx does not mean that the objectivity of value does not exist. The objectivity of value exists and exercises a material force that functions as an objective compulsion, but only in a commodity-producing society. The objectivity of value exists and exercises a material force that functions as an objective compulsion, but only in a commodity-producing society. The, quote, semblance consists in regarding this specific social relation as a definitive and unchangeable relation, as if people could not relate to the products of their labor as anything other than values, as if the objective compulsions of commodity production were humanity's inevitable fate. Section D. The society's movement taking on a life of society's movement's own and society's movement's content. This paragraph is still concerned with how the objective semblance consolidates itself, but it simultaneously addresses how the social fabric takes on a life of its own. A life of its own. Excuse me. Marx says that those engaging in exchange are initially interested in the quantitative proportions of exchange. Then he continues, quote, as soon as these proportions have attained a certain customary stability, these proportions appear to result from the nature of the products, ... The value character of the products of labor becomes firmly established only when the value character of the products of labor Jesus Christ, I fucked it up. Let me restart. Then Marx continues, quote, as soon as these proportions have attained a certain customary stability, these proportions appear to result from the nature of the products, ... The value character of the products of labor become firmly established only when they act as magnitudes of value, end quote. Marx contends that it is a consequence of the stability of exchange proportions, that is, the relations among value quantities, that the products exchanged acquire, alongside their useful characteristics, a, quote, value character, end quote, meaning that the quality of, quote, value, end quote, is attributed to them. About the magnitudes of value, the next sentence states, quote, these magnitudes of value vary continually, independently of the will, foreknowledge, and actions of the exchangers, end quote. Marx. Whereas Marx emphasizes the, quote, stability of value relations in the first sentence, Marx stresses value relations' constant change in the second. How can both claims be true? Obviously, Marx is talking about two distinct levels of social development in these last two quotes. The first level is that of the emergence of commodity production. The emergence of commodity production. As long as the exchange of products is rather rare and accidental, then coincidence, luck, and differences in knowledge of exchange are all decisive. It is only when exchange attains a certain regularity that coincidence and luck fade into the background in determining exchange proportions. This occurs in markets, where not only individual exchangers of products, but numerous exchangers, not just individuals, encounter one another. The exchange proportions now appear, quote, to result from the nature of the products, end quote. If this happens, then the production and circulation of commodities have come to dominate at least part of the society's production. Marx has emphasized this in the second paragraph on page 166. The second quote refers to this new level of development, which is that of widely established commodity production. Widely established commodity production. Now, if value magnitudes change, it is not a return to the coincidental nature of exchange proportions. A change in the magnitude of value no longer means that one seller of wheat receives a lot while another seller of wheat receives little, but rather that wheat's magnitude of value changes for all buyers and sellers. All buyers and sellers. Hence, Marx says about those involved in exchange, quote, Their movement within society has for them the form of a movement made by things, and these things, far from being under their control, in fact control them." End quote. Marx. The social bond is formed by the people living in society, quote, "their own movement within society," end quote. But under the conditions of commodity production, people living in society's interconnectedness is not only, as observed above, created unconsciously. Those exchanging know not what those exchanging do. For those involved in exchange, their interconnectedness takes on a life of their interconnectedness's own. Their interconnectedness takes on a life of their interconnectedness's own. Their interconnectedness controls the people instead of the people controlling their interconnectedness. But what is the exact nature of this societal movement that has taken on a life of its own? The nature of this societal movement that has taken on a life of its own is briefly outlined by Marx in the compound sentence that follows. The first part of the sentence lays out the conditions under which the nature of movement can be recognized, namely that, quote, "the production of commodities must be fully developed," end quote. Then comes a concise characterization of the nature of the movement. Quote, "all the different kinds of private labor, which are carried on independently of each other, and yet as spontaneously developed branches of the social division of labor, are in a situation of all-round dependence on each other, are continually being reduced to the quantitative proportions in which society requires those different kinds of private labor." End quote, Marx. In commodity production, labor activities occur independently of one another as private labor. However, these diverse labor activities are objectively interdependent, since these diverse labor activities are branches of the social division of labor. This interdependence entails a certain proportionality of the diverse labor activities. This interdependence entails a certain proportionality of the diverse labor activities. If, for example, a carpenter is to produce a certain number of tables, somebody must produce the necessary amount of wood and offer that amount of wood on the market. Again, if the carpenter, after selling the carpenter's tables, is to buy new clothes with his home, somebody must produce and offer this clothing. I fucked that up. I misread something. This independence entails a certain proportionality of the diverse labor activities. If, for example, a carpenter is to produce a certain number of tables, somebody must produce the necessary amount of wood and offer that wood on the market. Again, if the carpenter, after selling the carpenter's tables, is to buy new clothes with the carpenter's income, somebody must produce and offer this clothing, and so on. With the division of labor, the diverse labor activities must thus stand in a specific quantitative relation, quote, "quantitative proportions," end quote, as Marx describes it. However, under the regime of commodity production, this proportion is not known in the phase of production. To stick to our example, the wood producers don't know how much wood the carpenters will require. Carpenters don't know how many tables will be required. And clothing makers don't know how much clothing the carpenters will need. Of course, every producer attempts to estimate paying demand. But in the last instance, he doesn't know what that will be. The producer's estimates may prove wrong, which has consequences both for those who supply his inputs and for those who produce the commodities he would have otherwise consumed. If the carpenter falsely estimates the need for tables, then the carpenter will buy less wood and less clothing in the future, dashing the expectations of other producers. It is precisely the proportions of individual types of labor, unknown during production, that asserts itself in this, quote, movement of things, end quote, that has taken on a life of its own with regard to people. And how do these proportions assert themselves? They do it this way, quote, in the midst of the accidental and ever-fluctuating exchange relations between the products, the labor time socially necessary to produce the products violently asserts the labor time socially necessary to produce themselves as a regulative law of nature, end quote. Marx. Emphasis Michael Heinrich. The word, quote, violently, end quote, or, quote, forcefully, end quote, German, from the German word gewaltsam, is omitted from the English translation. That note is from the translator, who is Alexander Lukascio. The text says that, quote, socially necessary labor time asserts itself like a, quote, regulative law of nature, end quote. What does that mean? The first subsection of Chapter 1 characterized, quote, socially necessary labor time, end quote, as the time needed to produce a use value, quote, under the conditions of production normal for a given society, and with the average degree of skill and intensity of labor prevalent in that society, end quote. This means that if more than the socially necessary labor time is used, that excess does not add to the amount of value-creating abstract labor. The first subsection also stated that a product is only a commodity if that commodity possesses both use value and, quote, use value for others, social use values, end quote. As a result, if the use values produced exceed paying demand, then not all the labor time expended in producing these use values counts as value creating abstract labor. Marx draws this conclusion explicitly in Chapter 3. Hence, to see how the, quote, labor time socially necessary for production, end quote, asserts itself, both aspects have to be considered. The necessary labor time as determined by the conditions of production and the labor time needed to overcome paying demand. Both magnitudes are unknown to producers in advance. Only on the market is the individual producer informed about whether the individual producer's conditions of production correspond to the social average and whether this branch as a whole has produced too many products. The magnitude of value of his commodity conveys the information to him. The process by which, quote, socially necessary labor time, end quote, asserts itself in exchange is the same process by which the individually spent labor power is reduced to its, quote, quantitative proportion, end quote. That is, its share, according to the conditions of production and demand, in the aggregate social labor expended under the division of labor. Still, in what sense does Marx speak here of a, quote, natural law, end quote? Addendum. In a letter to Ludwig Kugelmann on the 11th of July, 1868, Marx likewise deals with the way that socially necessary labor time asserts socially necessary labor time self. Usually this passage from the letter is quoted in order to show that Marx was not concerned with a, quote, proof of value theory. But what interests us here is the way Marx speaks of, quote, natural laws, end quote. Quote, the chatter about the need to prove the concept of value arises only from complete ignorance both of the subject under discussion and of the method of science. Every child knows that any nation that stopped working, not for a year, but let us say just for a few weeks, would perish. And every child knows, too, that the amounts of products corresponding to the different amounts of needs demand differing and quantitatively determined amounts of society's aggregate labor. It is self-evident that this necessity of the distribution of social labor in specific proportions is not abolished by the specific form of social production. This necessity of the distribution of social labor in specific proportions can only change the necessity of the distribution of social labor in specific proportions form of manifestation. Natural laws cannot be abolished at all. The only thing that can change under historically differing conditions is the form in which those natural laws assert themselves, and the form in which this proportional distribution of labor asserts itself in a state of society in which the interconnection of social labor expresses the interconnection of social labor's self as the private exchange of individual products of labor is precisely the exchange value of these products. End quote. Marx. Letter to Kugelmann, 1868. What Marx describes as a, quote, natural law, end quote, here are necessities that are valid for all societies, which cannot simply be abolished by human beings. Nevertheless, the form in which these natural laws assert themselves changes in diverse modes of production. In commodity production, the proportionality between various labor activities does not assert the proportionality between various labor activities self by means of a traditional division of labor or a conscious plan by the members of society, but rather through, quote, socially necessary labor time, end quote, determining the commodity's magnitude of value. Marx uses, quote, natural law, end quote, here in a somewhat different sense than in the preface. There, in the preface, the term natural law referred to the objective character of social development. However, just as in our commentary on the preface, here too it should be remembered that natural laws had a different meaning in Marx's time than in today's social science. End addendum. At the end of the compound sentence on page 168, Marx stresses that the proportions among private labor activities assert themselves, quote, violently. In German, gewaltsam. Quote, in the same way, the law of gravity asserts the law of gravity self when a person's house collapses on top of him, end quote. Marx thus indicates how the process does not occur harmonically and gradually, but rather in a crisis-ridden and destructive way. However, until we have analyzed capitalist production relations, nothing more exact can be said about this. Talking of a, quote, law of nature, end quote, asserting itself, quote, violently, end quote, carries a critical undertone. Since producers do not arrive at the necessary proportions of their individual labor activities through a consciously coordinated process, but rather in a way that is mediated through the exchange of products, whereby those exchanging don't know what they're doing. It means that the entire process is just as strange and self-regulating to human beings as a natural process. As a result, the self-regulating way that the proportional distribution of labor asserts the proportional distribution of labor itself is not at all due to the, quote, natural law, end quote, since such a proportional distribution is necessary in every society, but rather due to the social conditions under which the law operates. As a result, the self-regulating way that the proportional distribution of labor asserts the proportional distribution of labor itself is not at all due to the, quote, natural law, end quote, since such a proportional distribution is necessary in every society, but rather due to the social conditions under which the law operates. What is key is the, quote, lack of awareness, end quote. In German, Bewusstlosigkeit. It's probably Bewusstlosigkeit. Or, quote, unconsciousness, end quote, of the social process, which Marx emphasizes in footnote 30, where Marx cites Engels' first economic work. The lack of awareness of the social process does not refer to people not knowing the content or outcome of this process, the proportional distribution of labor. The point is that this distribution asserts this distribution self, quote, unconsciously, end quote, not as a result of producers consciously cooperating, but rather through the unconscious functioning of the market. Thus, Marx writes at the end of this paragraph, echoing the last sentence of the first paragraph on page 167, quote, the determination of the magnitude of value by labor time is therefore a secret hidden under the apparent movements in the relative values of commodities. The determination of the magnitude of value by labor time's discovery destroys the semblance of the merely accidental determination of the magnitude of value of the products of labor, but by no means abolishes that determination's material form, end quote. End quote, Marx. This, quote, material form, end quote, value objectivity is not a mere phenomenon of consciousness. It is real and efficacious as long as people relate to the products of their labor as commodities. One second. Where are we at? Recording wise. Okay. New section. E. Quote, objective forms of thought, end quote. Objektive Gedankenformen. Second paragraph 168 to second paragraph 169. In the next two paragraphs, Marx focuses on the scientific knowledge of value. Marx observes that both, quote, reflection on the forms of human life, end quote, and, quote, scientific analysis, end quote, of these forms of human life first begin post festum, retrospectively, which means, quote, the forms which stamp products as commodities and which are therefore the preliminary requirements for the circulation of commodities already possess the fixed quality of natural forms of social life before men seek to give an account, not of their historical character, for in his eyes they are immutable, but of their content and meaning, end quote. Marx. So he's using post festum in a different way than I thought was the case. So that's me. That's my fault. What are the, quote, forms which stamp products as commodities, end quote? A product of labor becomes a commodity if the product of labor results from private labor and is exchanged on the market for other products. Then it attains the form of an object of value of a specific magnitude. Expending labor as private labor, behaving as if the products of private labor are private property, and exchanging them on the market, all of these forms appear, once established, as, quote, natural forms of social life, end quote. This means that the forms seem so self-evident that we no longer perceive them as specific social forms, but rather as forms in which life in every society must necessarily take place. This means that the forms seem so self-evident that we no longer perceive these forms as specific social forms, but rather as forms in which every society must necessarily in which life in every society must necessarily take place. Thus, according to Marx, when we contemplate social life, we do not discuss them as historical mutable forms. We only examine what is expressed in these forms. Addendum. What Marx states here is in rather general terms about the conception of historically specific forms as, quote, natural forms of social life, end quote, applies very well to Adam Smith. At the beginning of Smith's main work, The Wealth of Nations, Smith maintains that the essential difference between human beings and animals is that humans engage in exchange, but animals don't. Humans have a, quote, propensity to truck, barter, and exchange, end quote, which distinguishes them from animals. But if it's characteristic for human beings to exchange, then this means that it is, quote, natural, end quote, for human beings to regard their products as commodities. To the extent that people live in a society, the products of people's labor automatically become commodities. Hence, Smith regards the market economy based upon exchange as the, quote, natural order, end quote. Smith doesn't question the commodity form. What Smith's interested in is the content expressed in the commodity form. That the labor time necessary to produce the commodity determines the commodity's value. This tendency to naturalize a historically specific mode of economy persists among today's economists. The group appointed by the German federal government called the German Council of Economic Experts. The press fondly refers to them as the, quote, economic wise men, end quote, stated in its annual report for 1919 to 2000, quote, politicians can no more override the objective compulsions and human behavior arising from the laws of the market than politicians could override the law of gravity, end quote. In other words, the laws of the market are just as immutable and natural as the laws of gravity. That's in a quote. End addendum. Marx next states that the analysis of the content of these forms begins with the, quote, finished form, end quote, the money form. The analysis of commodity prices leads to the determination of the magnitude of value. While, quote, the common expression of all commodities in money, end quote, leads to the, quote, establishment of the commodity's character as values, end quote. This implies that economic analysis's historical course of development differs considerably from Marx's presentation of the sequence of the categories. Historically, the development proceeds from money and finds the underlying determinations of the commodity. By contrast, Marx proceeds from the commodities determination and develops the money form as a necessary form of value. As the next sentence makes clear, this is not just a difference in the direction of the argument, since it is the, quote, finished form of the world of commodities. The money form, which conceals the social character of private labor and the social relations between the individual workers, by making those relations appear as relations between material objects instead of revealing those relations plainly, end quote. Marx. What, quote, conceals, end quote, refers to is how the social relations between private laborers are represented as relations between things. For this reason, it's no longer visible, hence concealed, that they are relations between private laborers. Because Marx does not begin his presentation from the, quote, finished form, end quote, but for him, it is a result. He undoes this concealment. The rest of the paragraph deals with the, quote, absurdity, in German, Verrücktheit, or, quote, madness, end quote, generated by this concealment. Here Marx essentially picks up on the second particularity of the equivalent form, that is, a specific concrete labor activity becomes the form of appearance of abstract labor, and connects it to the general form of value. A specific concrete labor activity becomes the general form of appearance of abstract labor. In itself, the linen is by no means the, quote, universal incarnation of abstract labor, end quote. Just like a coat, boots, and so on, it is the embodiment of a specific concrete labor. Only in the expression of value, or more precisely as the general equivalent, does the linen, quote, count as the, quote, universal incarnation of abstract labor, end quote. What is, quote, absurd, end quote, is that a thing counts as something a thing is not. Marx now points out that, quote, absurd forms, end quote, bracket, verrückte Formen, are widespread in bourgeois economics. The categories of bourgeois economics consist precisely of forms of this kind. The categories of bourgeois economics are forms of thought which are socially valid and therefore objective. In German, objektive Gedankenformen. For the relations of production belonging to this historically determined mode of social production, i.e. commodity production, end quote. For the second time, the term, quote, bourgeois economics, end quote, shows up here. The term bourgeois economics is not as passing a mention as on page 139, but there is still no explanation. Addendum. In the postface to the second edition of Capital, Marx provides an explanation for the term, quote, bourgeois economics, end quote. There, in the postface to the second edition of Capital, Marx states that political economy qualifies as bourgeois, quote, insofar as political economy views the capitalist order as the absolute and ultimate form of social production instead of as a historically transient stage of development, end quote. Marx doesn't describe the discipline as, quote, bourgeois economics, end quote, because it consciously sides with capital, but rather because the discipline doesn't recognize capital's historicity. The term bourgeois economics does not refer to the intentions of individual economists, but to a certain type of theory. End addendum. When Marx calls the categories of bourgeois economics, quote, absurd forms, end quote, Marx is conceiving bourgeois economics somewhat more broadly than in the postface just quoted. Economics is, quote, bourgeois, end quote, if it cannot break through the appearance, mentioned at the beginning of the second paragraph on page 168, of viewing the social forms that, quote, stamp products as commodities, end quote, as, quote, natural forms, end quote, pertaining to all social life. Hence, Marx is characterizing any type of political economy that regards commodity production as permanent as bourgeois. Hence, Marx is characterizing any type of political economy that regards commodity production as permanent as bourgeois. Marx hints at the difficulty of breaking through this appearance when he makes reference to, quote, forms of thought which are socially valid and therefore objective, end quote. In effect, commodity production's social forms structure our perception and thoughts. Commodity production, it appears to be a matter of course that people expend their labor as private labor, that people exchange their products, that these products they exchange have not only use value but also value, that this value is expressed in money, etc. In effect, we can hardly imagine anything different. For people involved in commodity production, the forms themselves are not thematized, but, as Marx states above, only the content expressed in those forms. The forms themselves are socially objective, but only in a society based upon commodity production. What is illusory is how these forms seem to be something valid in all societies. See the conclusion of the first paragraph on page 167. Precisely because this is a semblance that commodity production generates, Marx now turns briefly to other forms of production. One second. Section F. Forms of production not based on commodity production. Third paragraph 169 to last paragraph 173. In the following sketches, do not lose sight of their purpose, which is to illustrate the, quote, mysticism of the world of commodities, end quote. Marx describes other forms of production here only insofar as other forms of production contrast with the world of commodities. Marx begins with Robinson Crusoe. On his island, Robinson undertakes diverse useful labor activities that are, quote, different modes of human labor, end quote. Robinson must decide how much time to spend on each activity, and this will depend on how much time is needed to achieve a specific outcome. Marx summarizes, quote, all the relations between Robinson and these objects that form Robinson's self-created wealth are here so simple and transparent, and yet those relations cannot all contain all the essential determinants of value, end quote. This requires close reading. Marx does not claim that value relations exist on Robinson's island. Because of the absence of exchange, this would be pure nonsense. Instead, he says that the, quote, essential determinants of value, end quote, are present. These, quote, essential determinants, end quote, obviously refer to the circumstances just listed in the text. This is the transhistorical, quote, content, end quote, of value determination that is referred to at the beginning of the section. The Robinson Crusoe example shows that this content is by no means indissolubly bound to the form of value. In particular, the example demonstrates that the proportional distribution of society's total labor among the particular branches of production can assume different forms. If that distribution asserts itself under commodity production as a, quote, movement made by things, end quote, independently of the knowledge and will of those engaging in exchange, in Robinson's case, it is a result of conscious decisions. Footnote. The Herr M. Wirth mentioned in the text is a German economist and journalist. German economist and journalist Max Wirth, who lived from 1822 to 1900, whose works were rather well known in Germany during the second half of the 19th century. As can be gleaned from the second edition's postface, Marx insisted that the German economists of his time were completely unoriginal. End footnote. Next, Marx considers social relations of the Middle Ages, characterized by a generalized personal dependence. In relations of, quote, personal dependence, we find obligations that are not based on contracts cancelable by either side, as in the wage-labor relation. Instead, such dependence is part of the person in question's status and is usually immutable. A serf is obligated to his lord for his whole life, and the lord, in turn, must protect and legally represent his serf during a lifetime. In the Middle Ages, besides such relations of general dependence, there was also some commodity production. At first, this commodity production was limited, but then gradually expanded. Also, serfs' payments in kind were slowly converted to money payments in the late Middle Ages, forcing dependent peasants to engage in commodity production. However, Marx leaves all this aside. Marx is only interested in the Middle Ages insofar as the Middle Ages contrast with commodity production. Hence, Marx's simplified picture of serfs producing only use values for their own subsistence, together with their duties to lords and church, but without commodity production. In that spirit, Marx says that, quote, there is no need for labor and labor's products to assume a fantastic form, end quote. That is, as abstract human labor and as value respectively, quote, different from their reality, end quote. That is, their sensually perceivable natural existence as concrete useful labor or a specific product. Why don't they have to take on this fantastic form? Marx answers, quote, the natural form of labor, its particularity, and not as in a society based on commodity production, its universality, is here its immediate social form, end quote. End quote, Marx. In commodity production, too, labor is always carried out as a particular useful activity, but labor is carried out as a particular useful labor activity privately. Private labor of this kind first becomes a component of the aggregate social labor retroactively through the exchange of products. By recognizing the product in exchange as the object of value, the labor that created this product is also recognized as abstract human labor. It is not in its initial, quote, particularity, end quote, as a specific concrete useful labor, but only in its, quote, universality, end quote, as abstract human labor, that the labor of commodity producers becomes social. Because a serf delivers part of the serf's product as a tribute, or performs specific concrete labor activities as payment in kind, without further mediation, the serf's particular labor is already a component part of the aggregate labor of medieval society. For this reason, Marx observes that in these simplified medieval relations, quote, the social relations between individuals in the performance of individuals' labor appears at all events as the individual's own personal relations and are not disguised as social relations between things, between the products of labor, end quote. Footnote: the German, the original, did I say end quote? The original German of this sentence begins with Marx speaking for the first time of, quote, character masks, end quote, poorly translated in the Penguin edition as, quote, roles, without further comment. Marx will return to this term at the beginning of chapter 2. End footnote. In these convention-based medieval relations, the, quote, natural form of labor, end quote, is simultaneously its, quote, immediately social form, end quote. This contrasts with commodity-producing labor, where the only labor that has an immediate social form is that which produces the body of the general equivalent, e.g., gold. However, that a serf's labor possesses an immediate social form by no means implies that it is, quote, labor in common, i.e., directly associated labor, end quote. However, that a serf's labor possesses an immediate social form by no means implies that a serf's labor is, quote, labor in common, i.e., directly associated labor, end quote. Marx refers here to labor that is also carried out in common. His example of the labor carried out in common is a peasant family that produces food, clothing, and so on for the peasant family's own need. Here again, Marx simplifies by disregarding the petty trade that is typically present in these circumstances to offer the clearest possible contrast with commodity production. The peasant family's diverse products, quote, confront the family as so many products of the peasant family's collective labor. But the peasant family does not confront, the peasant family's diverse products, quote, confront the family as so many products of the family's collective labor. But these products do not confront each other as commodities, end quote. The various kinds of labor, quote, are already in their natural form social functions. The various kinds of labor are functions of the family, which, just as much as a society based on commodity production, possesses its own spontaneously developed division of labor, end quote. Finally, Marx considers an, quote, association of free people, end quote, working with the means of production held in common and expending their many different forms of labor power in full self-awareness as one single, quote, social labor force, end quote. Evidently, this, quote, association of free people, end quote, refers to a communist society. A communist society. Footnote. Here the Penguin Edition's translation, there's two footnotes. Here the Penguin Edition's translation uses a somewhat sexist phrase, quote, an association of free men, end quote. By contrast, the original German phrase, quote, einen Verein freier Menschen, end quote, is gender neutral. Alexander Locascio. End footnote. Footnote. Marx did not develop a detailed conception of communist society. On the contrary, Marx's isolated statements about it were usually offered in the course of criticizing capitalist relations. In the last chapter of my introduction, I summarize what one can glean from Marx's dispersed comments regarding his conception of communism. For another discussion of Marx's various suggestions in this regard, especially those found in Capital's section on fetishism, see Iber. Is it Christoph Iber? I don't know. It doesn't even seem like there's a... What's it? Christian Iber. End footnote. I'm like losing sunlight out here. Still, Marx does not further describe the society, limiting himself to remarking on its differences from commodity production. In this society, there is clearly neither private property of the means of production nor private labor. Individual acts of labor are coordinated from the get-go, and thereby also form part of the aggregate labor of society from the outset. Thus, the total product of the society is, quote, a social product, end quote. Individual products of labor do not have to first be recognized as values. A part of the total product is used as means of production while another part is consumed by the society's members and has to be distributed among the society's members. Marx doesn't say anything about how the society makes decisions about which part of the product is to be used as means of production and which new products... Sorry, one second. I had to turn on a light. Marx does not say anything about how the society makes decisions about which part of the product is to be used as a means of production and which new products to produce. Nevertheless, regarding distribution for consumption, Marx assumes, quote, only for the sake of a parallel with the production of commodities, that the share of each individual producer in the means of subsistence is determined by his labor time, end quote. Marx does not claim that things must actually be done this way in a communist society. On the contrary, the immediately preceding sentence points out that the manner of distribution will change as society develops. Here Marx is concerned merely with maintaining the greatest possible parallel with commodity production. The parallel resides in the dual function of individual labor times. On the one hand, they must be allotted among the various branches of production. On the other hand, individual labor times measure the individual producer's share in the product that is to be consumed. Under commodity production, the distribution of labor among the branches of production is a process playing out, quote, independently of the will, foreknowledge, and actions, end quote, of the producers. Labor's non-proportional distribution among the different branches of production can lead to the affected producers not having their products recognized in exchange as values or recognized as values of lesser magnitude. This affects their share in the total product, allowing them to purchase fewer means of production and subsistence than needed. It is otherwise in the, quote, association of free people, end quote, where the distribution of individual labor activities among the diverse branches of production occurs, quote, in accordance with a definite social plan, end quote. Additionally, the share of the products destined for consumption is distributed according to a specific social rule, such as distributing it proportionally to working hours. In commodity production, value mediates both processes. The social relationships among the private labor activities, therefore, present themselves as social relationships among things. By contrast, in the association of free people, the, quote, social relations of the individual producers, both towards the individual producer's labor and the products of the individual producer's labor, are here transparent in their simplicity, end quote. Marx. In summary, we may say that in all the forms of production under consideration, various types of labor are performed in proportions determined by the social division of labor. Labor time plays an essential role in all, but in none must the different types of labor be reduced to equal labor. Labor time plays an essential role in all of these forms of production, but in none of these forms of production must the different types of labor be reduced to equal human labor. That only happens in commodity production. Only there do individual acts of labor need to have the twofold social character mentioned on page 166. both satisfying a social need and being equal to other acts of labor. In all other forms of production, individually expended labor time, in that individually expended labor time's particularity, is already part of the aggregate labor of society. It merely has to satisfy a social need. In commodity production, however, labor is expended as private labor, only retroactively, insofar as that private labor is reduced to equal human labor in exchange, and this means, in its universality, does this private labor become a component of society's aggregate labor, which will be discussed in Appendix 2. New section, Section G, Religion and Mode of Production, second paragraph 172 to first paragraph 173. After this quick review of forms of production not based on commodity production, Marx addresses the connection between religion and relations of production. According to Marx, quote, Christianity, with Christianity's religious cult of man in the abstract, end quote, is, quote, the most fitting form of religion, end quote, for a, quote, society of commodity producers, end quote, who relate those commodity producers' private labor to each other as, quote, homogeneous human labor, end quote. Marx does not claim that commodity production brought about Christianity. Marx merely points to a correspondence. In commodity production, diverse types of labor are equated to one another. However, these diverse types of labor are only equal in abstraction from these diverse types of labor's differences, as abstract human labor. The same is the case for commodity owners. If we consider people as commodity owners, we abstract from every concrete determination, and the commodity owner's differences become mere coincidence. The situation is similar with Christianity. Differences between people are merely coincidental, all being equal before God as God's creations. In that sense, Marx perceives a correspondence. Fundamental religious ideas match fundamental social structures. Marx sees the greatest correspondence between Protestantism and deism, which conceives a divine creator who does not intervene in the world, since there the Christian God is stripped of medieval imagery and becomes a largely abstract principle. The, quote, ancient social organisms of production, end quote, those that are not based upon commodity production, are, quote, much more simple and transparent than those of bourgeois society, end quote, based upon commodity production. But Marx continues, quote, they are conditioned by a low stage of development of the productive powers of labor and correspondingly limited relations between men within the process of creating and reproducing their material life. Hence also limited relations between man and nature. These real limitations are reflected in the ancient worship of nature and in other elements of tribal religions, end quote. Marx. Addendum. In this paragraph, Marx posits an unspecified connection between the level of the forces of production, the relations of production among people, and their conceptual world. In doing so, Marx picks up on claims from the preface to Marx's Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy of 1859. There Marx presented the following as a, quote, general conclusion, end quote, of Marx's research, quote, in the social production of men's existence, men inevitably enter into definite relations which are independent of men's will, namely relations of production appropriate to a given stage in the development of their material forces of production. The totality of these material forces of production, the totality of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation on which arises a legal and political superstructure and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. The mode of production of material life conditions the general process of social, political, and intellectual life. It is not the consciousness of men that determines men's existence, but men's social existence that determines their consciousness. End quote. Marx. Traditional Marxism used the brief sketch in this preface and a few other texts as the basis of, quote, historical materialism, end quote, a term not found in Marx's work, which was frequently understood as a comprehensive explanation of history. Typically, the way the, quote, base, end quote, was supposed to, quote, condition the, quote, superstructure was understood as determination. Nevertheless, Marx primarily emphasizes the idea of, quote, correspondence. Not every, quote, superstructure is compatible with a given, quote, base. The superstructure must correspond to the base in a certain sense, but is not completely determined by the base. Incidentally, Marx rarely used the terms, quote, base and, quote, superstructure, in contrast to the spokespeople of traditional Marxism. And addendum. It is precisely this idea of, quote, correspondence that Marx attempts to make clear in the passage of Capital just discussed. Depending on the economic relations and material conditions of life, certain ideas become more plausible. For example, some religious notions, but also legal, ethical, and political notions, appear to people to be particularly insightful. The point, then, is not to explain the emergence or even conscious conceptualization of such ideas, but rather the social conditions for their assertion. In the last part of the paragraph, Marx says that, quote, religious reflections of the real world, end quote, can only vanish when relations between people and toward nature become transparent and rational. Marx does not claim that religion would automatically vanish in a communist society. Marx merely notes that there would no longer be any social ground for religion's plausibility. We cannot assume that religion would actually vanish, since human beings may also use such beliefs to process personal suffering that cannot be excluded from any form of society. At the end of the paragraph, Marx emphasizes that these transparent and rational relations will only emerge when the process of production, quote, becomes production by freely associated men and stands under men's conscious and planned control, end quote. That is, in the, quote, association of free people, end quote, mentioned above, or communist society. Such a societal condition, however, requires, quote, a series of material conditions of existence, end quote, which are themselves, quote, the natural and spontaneous product of a long and tormented historical development, end quote. Marx. Addendum. Marx picks up here on an idea from the preface to the Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. In the preface to the Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, Marx wrote, quote, at a certain stage of development, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production, or, this merely expresses the same thing in legal terms, with the property relations within the framework which they have operated hitherto, ... No social formation is ever destroyed before all the productive forces, for which that social formation is sufficient, have been developed, and new superior relations of production never replace older relations of production, before the material conditions for the new superior relations of production existence have mutated within the framework of the old society, end quote. Marx. End addendum. The first half of the second sentence is problematic. It's not clear what determines the extent of the forces of production for which a given social formation is, quote, sufficient. On the one hand, capitalism has proven extraordinarily flexible in this sense. On the other hand, people have frequently revolted against capitalism's impositions, despite capitalism's being far from exhausting all possible development of capitalism's productive forces. Nevertheless, what is decisive is the second half of the sentence, the, quote, material conditions of existence, end quote. Also mentioned in the passage from Capital, of a new mode of production must emerge, quote, from within the framework of the old society, end quote. A new mode of production cannot simply be dreamed up and then implemented. A new mode of production must always base that new mode of production self on something already existing. The question that must be discussed again and again, however, is what exactly this, quote, something, end quote, is. New section, section H. Commodity and value in political economy, the analysis of fetishism as a precondition for a critique of political economy. This part's second paragraph, 733 to 177. This part's first paragraph is of central importance to understanding why Marx subtitled his work, Critique of Political Economy. For the first time, Marx explicitly criticizes political economy as a whole, not just individual authors. This paragraph stretches from page 173 to page 175 and has 3 long footnotes that elaborate some of the claims. For reasons of clarity, my commentary focuses first on the paragraph, then on the 3 footnotes. In the first sentence, Marx credits political economy with having, quote, both analyzed value and value's magnitude, end quote, and, quote, uncovered the content concealed within these forms, end quote. The next sentence makes clear that the, quote, content mentioned is labor. The analysis is, quote, incomplete, end quote, however, and footnote 33 explains how Marx understands its incompleteness. In the next sentence, Marx makes a fundamental critique of political economy, quote, but political economy has never once asked the question why this content, labor, has assumed that particular form, value. That is to say, why labor is expressed in value, and why the measure of labor by labor's duration is expressed in the magnitude of the value of the product, end quote. Marx. Marx does not accuse political economy's analysis of yielding an incorrect result. On the contrary, Marx concedes that political economy's result is largely correct, but rather of missing a question. Missing a question. This amounts to a much deeper critique. Having to rectify incorrect results through scholarly debate is a matter of course in the scientific process. However, if we observe the absence of certain questions, not as the isolated error of a few scholars, but as a systematic problem within an entire science, this is very different. It puts on trial the foundations of the science, that is, the hitherto unquestioned system of conceptual coordinates of that science. On pages 165 and 166, Marx already answered, in a brief way, the question of why labor assumes the form of value. There, Marx pointed out that only the products of individual private labor become commodities, and because producers only enter into contact through exchange. The specific social character of the producer's labor first appears in exchange as an objective property of the producer's labor products. See my commentary under point B. Therefore, it is a specific sort of social interconnectedness that causes labor to be represented as value, because causing this content to take on that form. In footnote 34, Marx goes on to identify the reason that political economy was unable to pose the question of, quote, why. That political economy did not pose the question of why, means that these forms appeared to political economy as completely self-evident. Quote, formulas which bear the unmistakable stamp of belonging to a social formation in which the process of production has mastery over man instead of the opposite, appear to the political economist bourgeois consciousness to be as much a self-evident and nature-imposed necessity as productive labor itself, end quote. Marx. Addendum. The words formulas, in German Formeln, here is probably a printing error in the second and subsequent German editions. In the preceding sentence, only, quote, forms, Formen, are mentioned. In the first edition and in the French translation, corrected by Marx, quote, forms is used instead of, quote, formulas. And addendum. The phrase used to characterize these forms, quote, the process of production has mastery over man instead of man having mastery over the process of production, end quote, alludes to the state of affairs described on page 167. That is, under the conditions of commodity production, our, quote, own movement within society, end quote, has, quote, the form of a movement made by things, end quote. Commodity production controls people rather than people controlling commodity production. These historically specific and therefore mutable forms, which, quote, bourgeois consciousness, end quote, sees as a, quote, self-evident and nature-imposed necessity, end quote, are the fetishistic forms of the world of commodities. In other words, Marx criticizes political economy for remaining caught up in the fetishism of the world of commodities that political economy is unable to penetrate. This also illustrates Marx's claim in the letter to Lassalle that was quoted in commenting on Capital's subtitle, A Critique of Political Economy. In that letter, Marx emphasized the need to formulate a critique by means of an expose. The exposition of the commodity fetish serves at the same time as a critique of the category of, quote, value within bourgeois economics. Now, the question emerges as to whether bourgeois economics recognize any, quote, pre-bourgeois, end quote, forms of production, that is, not based upon commodity production, whose existence would call into question the, quote, self-evident and nature-imposed necessity, end quote, of bourgeois forms. Political economy knew of such forms, but according to Marx, it treated them, quote, in much the same way as the fathers of the church treated pre-Christian religions, end quote. The fathers of the church doctors from the first decades after Christ, felt competition from the pre-Christian religions. They treated each other as a cluster of absurdities to be contrasted with the one true religion, Christianity. This is further explained in footnote 35. Footnote 33. Footnote 33 deals with with political economy as, quote, incomplete, end quote, analysis of value. Marx states that, quote, classical political economy, end quote. Footnote 34 has information on this term, failed to recognize the dual character of the labor that produces commodities. Nowhere did it, quote, explicitly, end quote, distinguish between concrete useful labor, which generates use values, and abstract human labor as the substance of value. This was a distinction that Marx described as, quote, crucial to an understanding of political economy, end quote, in the second subsection. However, Marx does concede that classical political economy made the distinction, quote, in practice, end quote, insofar as classical political economy spoke, on the one hand, of labor in a qualitative sense, and the other in a purely quantitative sense, since merely quantitative differences presupposes a qualitative equality. Failure to make explicit the difference between the two characteristics of commodity-producing labor leads to a number of misunderstandings and problems. The rest of the footnote is dedicated to an example of this. Ricardo's debate with Destutt de Tracy, a French economist. Actually, the example contains another misunderstanding. Tracy regarded the, quote, value of labor, end quote, as responsible for the value of the commodities it creates. According to Marx, Ricardo understands Tracy to mean that labor is represented in value and not the, quote, value of labor, end quote. Marx describes Tracy's conception as, quote, the commonplace error of the vulgar economists who assume the value of one commodity, here labor, in order to use it in turn to determine the values of other commodities, end quote. The notion of the, quote, value of labor, end quote, has been discussed above. See my commentary on page 137, footnote 16, and it plays a central role in Capital's chapter 19. Smith sometimes confused the determination of value by labor with the, quote, value of labor, end quote. Ricardo doesn't recognize that Tracy fell into the same mix-up. Footnote 34. Footnote 34 explains the reasons economic science failed to pose the question of, quote, why this content has assumed that particular form, end quote. Marx contends, quote, one of the chief failings of classical political economy is that classical political economy has never succeeded, by means of classical political economy's analysis of commodities, and in particular of commodities, those commodities' value, in discovering the form of value, which in fact turns value into exchange value, end quote. Marx. Classical political economy's main deficiency is that classical political economy failed to do what Marx proposed with his analysis of the value form, to demonstrate that value requires an independent value form. Still, the question arises as to why classical political economy failed here. Additionally, there is the question of why classical political economy did not even attempt to demonstrate that value requires an independent value form. As Marx indicated in the introduction to the value form section, is not only because of political economy's interest in the magnitude of value, a reason Marx has given before, see footnote 17 on Bailey, rather is primarily due to the following. Quote, the value form of the product of labor is the most abstract but also the most universal form of the bourgeois mode of production, by the fact that the value form of the product of labor stamps the bourgeois mode of production as a particular kind of social production, of a historical and transitory character. If then we make the mistake of treating it as the eternal natural form of social production, we necessarily overlook the specificity of the value form, and consequently of the commodity form together with the commodity form's further developments, the money form, the capital form, etc. End quote, Marx. Marx speaks here of the, quote, value form of the product of labor, end quote. Although, to be precise, Marx should say the, quote, value form of the commodity, end quote, since it is only when the product of labor exists as a commodity that it makes sense to talk about the value form. Marx calls it, quote, the most abstract, end quote, most universal, end quote, form of the bourgeois mode of production. It is the most abstract form, since the value form does not presuppose any further relations, as for example, capital does. The value form is the most universal form of the bourgeois mode of production, since, quote, production for exchange, end quote, which means that labor products become commodities and the commodity's value obtains an independent form, is the most typical feature of this mode of production. Now, if production for exchange is not seen as a specific mode of production, but rather as, quote, the most eternal natural form of social production, end quote, then the specificity of the value form and all the form determinations of key economic categories that build upon the value form are overlooked. Marx used the expression, quote, bourgeois economics, end quote, on page 169. In commenting on that passage, I pointed out that Marx considered political economy to be, quote, bourgeois, end quote, because political economy conceives of the specific social forms that make labor products into commodities as, quote, natural forms of social life, end quote. What Marx is pointing to in this footnote is precisely this, quote, bourgeois, end quote, character of economics, which prevents economics from adequately grasping the value form. Addendum. In the late 1840s, Marx was already criticizing political economy for regarding capitalism as eternally valid rather than a historically transitory mode of production. At that time, Marx was unable to explain how bourgeois economists arrived at this ahistorical conception. Additionally, Marx was still convinced that Ricardo, among the political economists, had on the whole correctly explained the capitalist mode of production's way of functioning. In the late 1840s, Marx therefore relied on Ricardo's theory in both his critique of capitalism, for example in his lecture series Wage, Labor, and Capital, and in his debate with Proudhon. At this time, Marx was critically applying bourgeois economics, but Marx did not yet have a critique of bourgeois economics categories. At this time, Marx was critically applying bourgeois economics, but Marx did not yet have a critique of bourgeois economics categories. The critique of bourgeois economics categories first began in the early 1850s. Hence, Marx criticized Ricardo's theory of money for the first time in 1851. See Marx's letter to Engels, February 3rd, 1851. Marx developed this critique of categories comprehensively in subsequent years. However, Marx first recognized the importance of fetishism in the late 1850s. End addendum. Understanding fetishism allows Marx to explain how political economy is prone to an ahistorical approach. It is the bourgeois mode of production itself that makes social relationships into objective properties of things, and that, in turn, generates the illusion that what is valid for this mode of production applies to every type of social production. The unhistorical conception of the bourgeois mode of production also affects how economic relations are analyzed. If we conceive the bourgeois mode of production as, quote, the eternal natural form of social production, end quote, then we may examine the bourgeois mode of production's, quote, content, end quote, such as the determination of value by labor, but we can no longer see the historically specific features of its forms, that is, why labor is expressed as value, why the value of the commodity requires an independent manifestation in the value form, etc. We miss the specificity of both the value form and the categories that build upon the value form, the money form, the capital form. Addendum. For a long time, the value form failed to enter into the Marxist discourse. That discourse emphasized the historical character of the capitalist mode of production, concentrating on the content but neglecting the forms and the form's characteristics. This is exactly what Marx criticized in bourgeois economics. That Marxists had a restricted conception of Marx's analysis was partly fostered by the, quote, paradigm shift, end quote, a change in fundamental conceptions that occurred in bourgeois economics. In the last third of the 19th century, classical political economy, which still held value to be determined by labor, gave way to, quote, marginalism, end quote, which in the end based value on, quote, marginal utility, end quote. See my commentary on Capital's title. Marx could concede to classical political economy that classical political economy more or less correctly grasped the, quote, content that determined value. But this was no longer true for marginalism. In debating with marginalism, Marxists therefore insisted upon this content, meaning that the debate between Marxist and bourgeois economists fundamentally turned on the question of value was determined only by labor or by marginal utility. The value form disappeared from the debates. And addendum. Earlier in footnote 33, Marx uses the expression, quote, vulgar economists, end quote, and, quote, classical political economy, end quote. Now, at the end of footnote 34, Marx clarifies his use of these expressions. According to Marx, classical political economy, quote, investigated the real internal framework, Zusammenhang, of bourgeois relations of production, end quote. By contrast, the vulgar economists, quote, only flounder around within the apparent framework of those relations, ceaselessly ruminate on the material long since provided by scientific political economy, and seek their plausible explanations of the crudest phenomena for the domestic purposes of the bourgeoisie, end quote. Marx. There are two important points here. Marx first does not dispute the scientific character of classical political economy, in contrast to vulgar economics. Second, Marx distinguishes between the, quote, internal framework, end quote, and the mere, quote, apparent framework, end quote, in capitalist reality. Marx distinguishes between classical political economy and vulgar economics, not on the basis of the economist's intentions, but rather the economist's focus, that is, the economist's object of study. Addendum. With regard to the second point, there is a slightly different emphasis than in the second edition's postface. In the second edition's postface, Marx relates the development of political economy to the level of class struggle, contending that political economy, quote, can only remain a science while the class struggle remains latent, or manifests itself only in isolated and sporadic moments, end quote. Marx says that in England and France, class struggle assumed, quote, threatening forms, end quote, from 1830 onward, with a consequence, quote, it sounded the knell of scientific bourgeois economics. It was thenceforth no longer a question whether this or that theorem was true, but whether it was useful to capital or harmful, expedient or inexpedient, in accordance with police regulations or contrary to police regulations. In place of disinterested inquirers, there stepped hired prize-fighters. In place of genuine scientific research, the bad conscience and evil intent of apologetics, end quote. Marx. This is a highly simplified perspective. In the first place, Marx observed in theories of surplus value that there were also forms of vulgar economics in the period before 1830 and scientific approaches after 1830. Moreover, Marx reduces the difference between science and apologetics, that is, the justification of existing conditions, to an author's intentions, quote, disinterested, end quote, inquiry on the one hand, and, quote, hired prize fighters, end quote, on the other. The pointed language of the postface aims to present the critique of political economy as the sole legitimate heir to classical political economy. This grossly simplifies Marx's reasoning in the Fetishism section, which differentiates projects within bourgeois economics on the basis of their objective and not the economist's intention. This grossly simplifies Marx's reasoning in the Fetishism section, which differentiates projects within bourgeois economics on the basis of those projects' object and not the economist's intention. This simplified view has influenced many Marxists who frequently regard all bourgeois economists after Marx as embodying the vulgar economics of, quote, hired prize fighters, end quote. Contemporary talk shows and newspapers' business sections may be full of such figures, but the whole of bourgeois economics cannot be reduced to apologetics. Footnote 35. Footnote 35 appears in a paragraph on pages 173 to 175, dealing with bourgeois economics' treatment of pre-bourgeois modes of production. This question arises because Marx said that bourgeois economics conceives of the capitalist mode of production as eternally valid. Marx describes their approach to pre-bourgeois modes of production by quoting from Marx's earlier text, The Poverty of Philosophy, For bourgeois economics, pre-bourgeois institutions are, quote, artificial, in the sense of not being appropriate to human beings. But bourgeois institutions are, quote, natural, corresponding to human beings' quote, nature. Even today, there are similar justifications of the market economy, and what Marx intended here is parody, quote, thus there has been history, but there is no longer any, end quote, would take on a new life at the beginning of the 1990s. At that time, when capitalism seemed to have finally asserted itself worldwide, Francis Fukuyama would advance the idea explicitly and uncritically in his much-quoted essay on the, quote, end of history. At the end of the footnote, Marx addresses a critique of his general statements about society and history in the preface to Contribution to a Critique of Political Economy, discussed above briefly in the commentary on pages 172 to 73. As a kind of introduction to the subsequent discussion, Marx refers first to the French economist Frédéric Bastiat, who lived from 1801 to 1850, about whom Marx wrote in the second edition's postface that he was, quote, the most superficial and therefore the most successful representative of apologetic vulgar economics, end quote. Bastiat stressed the capitalist market's beneficial effects and the fundamental harmony among the interests of social classes, which is why Bastiat is still esteemed today. Marx liked to poke fun at the superficiality of Bastiat's arguments, as Marx does here. Even if one accepts Bastiat's claim that the Greeks and Romans lived primarily from plunder, something still had to be produced that could be plundered. Production is an indispensable precondition for all human life, and therefore also of social life. Marx next mentions an anonymous critic's objection launched against the preface to the Contribution, which Marx does not dispute, that in the Middle Ages and Antiquity, Catholicism and politics respectively, quote, dominated, end quote, each society. However, Marx confronts that objection with the thesis that it's the relations of production among people, quote, the manner in which they gained their livelihood, end quote, that explains the dominant roles of politics and Catholicism in each of those societies. The reference to Don Quixote shows that Marx's claim in the preface to the Contribution that there is a certain correspondence between base and superstructure is not an especially profound truth. This is because it is obvious to all readers that the non-correspondence of Don Quixote's imagined superstructure with Spain's economic base at the time is what makes the novel comic. Returning to the main text, the rest of the chapter deals with fetishism's consequences for bourgeois economics. Marx sees the debate about nature's role in the, quote, formation of exchange value, end quote, as due to the illusion generated by fetishism, values, quote, objective semblance, end quote, Gegenständlichkeit, which Fox translates as, quote, objective appearance, end quote, deceives some economists into seeking even a physical cause's value. The next paragraph makes it clear that fetishism is not limited to the commodity. There are also fetishes of money and capital. Addendum. Some Marxist literature trades rather liberally on the term, quote, fetishism. We read of the, quote, wage fetishism, and sometimes even of the, quote, state fetish. In fact, Marx speaks of, quote, mystifications and, quote, inversions in a variety of contexts. But Marx uses the term fetish only in reference to the commodity, money, and capital. At the end of the commentary on Chapter 2, I briefly address what these three fetishisms have in common. And addendum. This paragraph also indicates that there are different degrees of difficulty in seeing through the various forms of fetishism. About commodity fetishism, Marx says that commodity fetishism's, quote, still relatively easy to penetrate, end quote. The case of money fetishism is not so simple, but Marx concedes that, quote, modern political economy, end quote, seems free from the, quote, illusions of the monetary system, end quote. The idea that gold and silver naturally possess value. By contrast, the fetishism of modern economics becomes, quote, quite palpable when, the fetishism of modern economics deals with capital. By contrast, the fetishism of modern economics becomes, quote, quite palpable when modern economics deals with capital, end quote. Marx. Since we have not yet dealt with money and capital, the reflections above are no more than an anticipation, and thus not further elaborated here. However, it should be recognized that Marx concedes that at least part of bourgeois economics partially sees through fetishism. Based on Marx's earlier statements, one might get the impression that Marx sees bourgeois economics as completely caught up in fetishism. However, that's not the case. Fetishism is not a universal web of delusion that nobody can escape, but more like universal background lighting. Still, even though bourgeois economics managed to partially escape the effects of fetishism, bourgeois economics never perceived fetishism for what fetishism is. That's why bourgeois economics was unable to ask what characterizes fetishism. The question with which Marx introduced the fetish section, what is the secret of the commodity form, is not posed by bourgeois economics, since for it the commodity form never assumes the status of a problem. That the commodity fetish is easier to penetrate than the other fetish forms does not mean that the entirety of bourgeois economics is actually seen through it. In the remainder of Chapter 1, Marx provides two striking examples of how one can be misled by fetishism. Marx quotes an anonymous author and Samuel Bailey, already known to us from the subsection on the value form. Both the anonymous author and Samuel Bailey see use value as a relation between humans and things, but see value as a property inhering in things themselves, which becomes apparent when commodities relate to each other in exchange. Marx counters this notion of value's materiality with a simple observation, quote, so far no chemist has discovered exchange value either in a pearl or a diamond, end quote. Again, Marx should have used, quote, value, end quote, instead of, quote, exchange value. Marx's parting shot picks up the words of a figure from Shakespeare's comedy Much Ado About Nothing. This is Dogberry, a somewhat dim, over-eager constable whose statements are unintentionally comic. By comparing Samuel Bailey and the anonymous author to a figure like Dogberry, Marx makes a subtle but scathing criticism. In a similar way, Marx earlier used a literary allusion to mock Proudhon. On footnote 38 appended here, Marx observes that the Ricardians were unable to provide a compelling answer to Bailey's critique of Ricardo, quote, because they are unable to find in Ricardo's own works any elucidation of the inner connection between value and the form of value or exchange value, end quote. In footnote 38 appended here, Marx observes that the Ricardians were unable to provide a compelling answer to Bailey's critique of Ricardo, quote, because the Ricardians are unable to find in Ricardo's own works any elucidation of the inner connection between value and the form of value or exchange value, end quote. Emphasis Michael Heinrich. Here Marx emphasizes that the non-comprehension of the, quote, inner connection between value and the form of value, end quote, is Ricardo's key deficiency. In Capital, the book, this connection is the theme of the third subsection of the value form. In the first edition of Capital, Marx also stressed at the end of the value form analysis that, quote, what was decisively important, end quote, was, quote, to discover the inner necessary connection between value form, value substance, and value amount, end quote. In effect, Marx claims to have accomplished exactly what Marx accuses Ricardo of essentially failing to do. Footnote 38 seems to suggest, as footnote 34 did, that the decisive difference between classical political economy's labor theory of value and Marx's value theory is to be found in the analysis of the value form. However, This difference is a qualitative one. The analysis of the value form is a precondition for decoding the fetishism of the world of commodities. This, in turn, allows the categories of bourgeois economics to be grasped as expressions of the objective forms of thought caught up in this fetishism. That is, analysis of the value form is what makes possible Marx's, quote, critique of political economy, end quote. That's the end. Thank you so much for listening.